So Tuesday, and we're in Revelation chapter 15. I want to keep saying Genesis for some reason, but we're in Revelation chapter 15. Don't want to start over at this late date. I've labeled this prelude. This is just before the final judgment from God in chapter 16, the bowl judgments which will be poured out. That's what we'll be looking at here, is what's happening in heaven. Want to have a go back. I'm sorry. One of the things I didn't want to miss yesterday, and I did miss, is that the first reference to the city of Babylon was in chapter 14, verse 8. So Babylon is going to play a specific role in the rest of the book. So I wanted to point that out, and a lot of discussion as to whether or not Babylon is, we're talking about the literal city here or about a symbol. I'm going to advocate that we take it literally. Three reasons why I think we should take it literally. First one is that in the book of Revelation, place names are always literal unless specifically they're identified as a figure of speech. For example, back in chapter 11, verse 8, we heard about the cities figuratively called Sodom and Gomorrah. So those were figurative references to Jerusalem. But otherwise, unless it's, again, designated as a figure of speech, it's always literal in the book of Revelation. If we broaden our scope a little bit and look at this city in the context of biblical revelation, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, back in the book of Daniel, always referred to the literal city of Babylon as Babylon the Great. We also find that we can use literal cities as a figure of speech to designate something like their political influence, their spiritual or religious influence, their economic impact. So when we talk about Washington, D.C., we can use that as the term as a metonymy, figure of speech, substituting one thing for another for political power. We can refer to New York or London as a seat of economic power, or the Vatican or Mecca as the source of religious power. So these things can be, even though it's literal, it can be used as a figure of speech to symbolize something else. So I think for these reasons is enough to take it as a literal city, and we'll be taking it literally as we go through this. One last thing I'd point out is that there's, a certain symmetry in the Bible, that rebellion against God after the fall, after the flood, was focused in the plain of Shinar. We see the idolatry in the plain of Shinar again in the book of Daniel chapter 3. And Babylon is within that plain. It's about 6 miles from the plain of Dura, which is near Shinar, which is, I think, Babylon. So the fact that it would show up again as a center of idolatry at the end of the Bible has a certain sort of symmetry as well that we see displayed in God's revelation. So that's a minor consideration, really. But I think the fact that it's a literal place name in Revelation, it's how Nebuchadnezzar used it, or referred to the literal city, and the fact that we can use it as a figure of speech, even though it references a literal city, are all good reasons to take it literally, which I'll be doing. Back to chapter 15 now, after I've caught up here. Chapter 15 has 2 main sections here. The first section is about this sea of glass. Might confuse us a little bit. We'll try to unconfuse it. That goes down to verse 4, and then beginning in verse 5, we see this tabernacle, or kind of a movable tent in heaven. So again, John is witnessing these things. He says clearly in verse 1 of chapter 15 that he saw another sign in heaven, called the sign great and amazing. So John has seen some pretty amazing things at this point. So for him to say this sign particularly is great or amazing, should make us sit up and get our attention here as we look at this. And he sees 7 angels with 7 plagues. These are plagues that are being brought by these final 7 angels in chapter 16. So these are the final plagues that are going to be poured out. In fact, John makes it clear which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is finished. Back in chapter 6, I mentioned the fact that some people actually think that the judgments happen all at once. That is, they're concurrent. Trying to remember the names of them all, but the judgments that are poured out, the 3 phases of judgment, happen concurrently. I think this verse gives us evidence that these are happening sequentially. So we have the bowl judgments, we have the trumpet judgments before that, and then the first set of judgments as well, sequentially. And I think the fact that these are the last indicate that. It says that he sees this sea of glass mingled with fire. So this is unusual in the Bible. The only other place that a sea of glass is mentioned outside the book of Revelation is in the book of Job, Job 28:17, and it's mentioned in the context of gold. Later in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 16, and again in verse 21 of chapter 21, the sea of glass is associated with gold, so it seems to be highly valuable. The red color, the fire, may be this gold color. And in the middle of this, in the middle of this is God. And then we have those who have come out of the beast, have conquered the beast in his image, who have overcome the mark of the beast. These are the ones that died, that were being encouraged in the last chapter. They're standing there playing this, what he says, Song of Moses. So I think the sea of glass is separating God, but also it's a place of privilege for those who have persevered as God had called them to do in verse 14. They sing this Song of Moses. What the reference here is to Exodus 15, where Moses sang a celebratory and victory song after they had been delivered from the Egyptians who were tearing across the Red Sea that had been parted, and the sea came back over them and destroyed them. I think this is the song of victory that's going to happen, again, anticipating these final judgments that are going to be poured out. Notice that God is going to be feared in verse 4, and 3 reasons are given for fearing God. One is his holiness, one is his rule over the nations, and the other is his righteousness. And I think this is looking forward to, anticipating, talking about the worldwide worship of the Lord that's going to happen during Jesus' millennial reign, which begins in chapter 20. Verse 5, we see the sanctuary of the tent that he's looking at opened in heaven. It's unusual. Again, I don't have a great explanation why he's seeing not the temple, not the heavenly temple that the book of Hebrews talks about, but rather the movable tent that was with Israel in the desert. It's out of this that these final bowl judgments are being poured out. Notice in verse 7, we see these 4 living creatures. You know, they were introduced back in chapters 4 and 5, and I said they were agents of God's judgment, and they seem to be consistently associated with these angels. So it's this judgment. So it's the 4 living creatures give to the 7 angels the golden bowls full of God's wrath. So they're kind of acting as the intermediary there. And this wrath is going to be poured out from God, his power. No one's going to be able to enter the sanctuary until this wrath is poured out, until it's finished. So this is the culmination of God's wrath on the earth here. And it's really demonstrating God's judicial anger. He's not flying out of the handle, throwing a little hissy fit, or having a drama moment, as some of my kids would, especially when they were teenagers. That's not what's happening here. That's not God's character. He is pouring out wrath against sin, not against specific sins, but against sin of rejecting him, the sin of Adam that's been imputed to those who have refused to believe. And he is going to be vindicated here. And tomorrow, Wednesday, we'll see in very rapid succession these final bowl judgments being poured out. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, as we close in on the end of the book of Revelation. Good for you for persevering in this. Reading God's word, the world, the flesh, and the devil conspire against us to do these things. And it takes discipline and self-control and sacrifice to do it, and you've demonstrated that. So may God bless you for the time that you spend in his word.